Well, a very good evening to everybody. Just as the final few come on in, very warm welcome to you. Thank you for coming along to Lansdowne Church tonight here at Woodbury Avenue. I'm Peter Brown, one of the elders here, and this evening is the start of a new term of Big Questions evenings. We run, for those who've not been, how many haven't been to a Big Questions before? How many have we got? A few. Okay, well, you're very welcome. It's a very informal session, very much question and answers. It's an opportunity to ask those questions about our Christian faith that we have. And this evening is different. Again, Big Questions is held on the third Sunday of each month. Tonight, it's just called Your Questions Answered. So we're not following a specific theme. We're going to do it on a question time basis. So I am going to be Mr. Dimbleby tonight and try and any questions that come in to give to the panel, and then the opportunity for responses. So it's much more of a two-way conversation, I think, tonight. That's what we're hoping for. So we're not, as we normally do, have questions written down. The number to text is not on the screen behind me, but it will be on the screen, an opportunity to text any questions that you've got. And as I say, each of the panel will attempt, not each of them, but we'll put the various questions to the panel. Very briefly, for those on the panel, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
I'm Michael, one of the members here, and I work with university students around Europe doing similar things to this.
Great. Thank you. Emily?
I'm Emily. I'm also a member here, and I work with Christian unions in universities, so Christian students in Bournemouth and Winchester.
I'm Diane. I'm also a member here. Surprise, surprise. I'm retired. I was for many years a probation officer. I'm chair of Friends International locally.
And I'm Miles. I'm also a member here, and I'm also one of the ministers at the church. And that's me.
Great. Thank you very much. And just to give you a format for the evening is that we will shortly be watching a video which sort of kicks the evening off. There'll be a short talk from Michael, and then we'll have a question and answer session till about 5 to 7. There'll be a break, 10-15 minutes, where there's teas, coffees, biscuits, cakes being served, and an opportunity really just to chat through some of the content that we've had on the first part of the service. We'll then go into a second session for about 15 to 20 minutes, further questions that you may have, and then we'll have a summing up at the end and other events to look forward to later in this autumn term. So we'll kick off now with a short video which really just sets the scene. Thank you. Great. Well, there's a few questions there. Putting people on the spot in a Vox Pop environment and just asking what questions they would ask to God. And that's very difficult. I guess many of us know what we would ask, but many don't even know what they would ask. So to start the evening off, Michael, you're going to say a few words.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Pete. Well, in a moment we're going to have a few minutes for us to text in, or if we haven't already. But as we think about this topic of questions, one of the reasons why we want to encourage you to ask questions tonight is that we really think that questions are worth asking. Let me share a little bit of my own story. I became a Christian at quite a young age because I'd grown up in a Christian family. I'd heard about Jesus through my childhood. But I also grew up in Leicester, which was the first city in Britain to have an ethnic majority. More people from a non-British background than from a British background. And so it was a very ethnically diverse city, lots of different religious beliefs and backgrounds represented. And so when I went particularly to secondary school, I got exposed to the fact that as a Christian, my beliefs weren't always shared by other people. In fact, because it was an all-boys comprehensive school, people were quite happy to point out that their beliefs were different to mine and maybe mock me for what I believed. And so I started to ask myself the question, am I just a Christian because I happen to be born into a Christian family? And of course, if I'd been born into a Muslim family, I would be a Muslim, and an atheist family, I might be an atheist. Or are there reasons for being a Christian that are bigger than just my family upbringing? Well, there were 3 Christians, including myself, in our school of about 1,000 boys. And so we used to run a Christian union, which was pretty boring because there were only 3 of us in it. I was the president, my mate was the vice president, and the other guy was the secretary. And so after a number of months of running this Christian union between the 3 of us, we decided it'd be more fun to invite other people who weren't Christians to come and get involved too. So we would put on these events called Guerrilla Christian. We could have called tonight's event Guerrilla Christian, but it's a bit more polite just to say question time. But anyway, we would run these events and advertise them all around the school. We'd have stuff on all the registers and all the windows of every door and every corridor. And we would try and provoke people to come along and to prove how stupid Christians were. And of course, it was quite popular. We had maybe about 70 people in this room. Now, I have to say, as a 14-year-old, there was no way I was going to try and answer anyone's questions. But I got an older Christian friend from my church to come and do that instead. And I have to say, one of the things that really amazed me about that session was not that people were queuing up to become Christians, because they weren't, but watching how this older man was able to respond to, in a winsome and intelligent way, the questions that people had. And it made me think, actually, maybe there are answers to these questions. Maybe I shouldn't just be a Christian because my parents are Christians, but maybe it really is true. Maybe it really is worth believing. And that was quite a decisive moment in my life. It made me realize that actually, rather than shying away from questions, we can really face up to them. And so if you're not a Christian, my encouragement would be, ask your questions. If Christianity is true, objectively true, it's got nothing to fear from your questions, and it will stand up to them. I'd also want to say, if you are a Christian, don't be afraid to ask your questions as well. Because again, if Christianity is true, it will stand up to questions. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Doubt can be a good thing if it causes us to investigate and look into truth. So don't sweep those questions under the carpet, but actually ask them and see where the answers might lead you to. Now, just a couple of things worth saying before we kick off. Firstly, the nature of an event like this is going to be somewhat unsatisfactory because there's no way that in the time available we're going to be able to answer comprehensively every question that's going to come up. And that's why sometimes at Big Questions we look at one question in much more detail. So by nature of the event and the type of event we're running, we're not going to be able to give you everything on every question going. And if we did, it would take far too long. But hopefully it'll at least start you thinking, and we'll give you some tips about where you can continue that conversation and that investigation, and there'll be some resources that we mention at the end. The other thing I want to say is that we shouldn't ask, are there exhaustive answers to the questions that we might have? Because I can tell you straight away there aren't. But a better question is, are there sufficient answers to the questions that we have? Sufficient answers to make Christianity credible and worth believing. And that's my conviction. Not that we've got every answer to every question you could possibly ever ask. We don't. But it is my conviction that there are sufficient answers to show that Christianity is true and convincing and worth putting the weight of our lives behind. Now, I'm aware maybe some of us aren't convinced of that, and that's why we encourage you to ask your questions. So we're going to take just a couple of minutes now, if you haven't already, to think of those questions and to text them in. And we really do welcome your questions. What we would say is that if you don't have any questions, we assume you believe everything and you agree with the panel and everything. So if you don't, please tell us why. And you can keep texting in as the evening goes on. And as Pete said, we'll have a break in about 20 minutes or so for you to be able to discuss and to type down some more. But let's have a couple of minutes now. And you don't have to do this in silence. You can chat to the person next to you and discuss what your question might be. And then the two ways you can ask your questions tonight, by the text, but also from the floor, and there'll be a couple of roving mics heading round as well, so we'll alternate our way between those two formats. But turn to the person next to you, discuss what you might like to ask. We can't promise we'll be able to answer them all tonight, and then if you've got one, then if you've not already, text it down or get it ready to ask.
Okay, if there's, keep your questions coming. There are a good number that have come in already, which is great. And as I say, we've not done this format before, so quite like this. So let's see how it starts. We did have, many of you will remember, we did the Community Fun Day some weeks back, and we had a number of questions that came in on that day. The first one was how many sweets in the jar, but we'll go past that one. We'll leave that one alone. And the first one is, which I'm going to throw to Diane. First one was, how old is God? So a nice little easy one for Diane to start off on.
I think my first response is he's picked me because I'm the oldest and he thinks God is old. But the first answer I would say is you never say, well, God is as old as his tongue and a little bit older than his teeth, which is what people of my age say to their grandchildren. God is timeless. God created time. So God is ageless. He has no age. He's the one who made time and made age. So that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, we're so conditioned on time, aren't we?
You step out of time with God. He's eternal.
Is there anyone else? Any other?
I guess philosophers have talked so often about the idea of God being the uncaused cause. Everything that we know in this world is caused, it has a beginning and it has an end. But of course, if everything that begins to exist has a cause, we ask the question, well, who caused that first cause, as it were? Who is outside of that? And so that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If we've got an uncaused cause, a God who is eternal, he can be the first cause, as it were, of everything else through history. Actually, interestingly, up until probably 50, 60 years ago, a lot of people would have rejected the idea of a need for there to be a first cause to the universe, because they would say, well, the universe has always existed. But actually no one really says that these days, because we know that the universe did have a beginning point in time, which actually raised the question, well, what was the cause behind it? And the cause would have to be outside of space and time, something that itself wasn't caused, not a contingent being like anything else in the universe. So that would explain why God could be eternal and how that makes sense of our world too.
It's a very different concept that people struggle to get their heads round, certainly. But is there any comment from the floor at all? Does anybody want to follow that up with a question? Is there? So we're happy that time is only something that we have here on earth, and God is outside of time. But that's the view. Okay. Another question. We've got one on the mic, I think.
Hello. Good. So if someone says, I believe that when you're dead, there is no afterlife, how would you respond to someone who says that? I believe that when you're dead, there is no afterlife.
Emily, would you like to take that? Or I'm just going to pick on them at the moment.
Sure. I think I might ask, how do you know? That's quite a faith statement, isn't it? I wonder what that's based on. But I think also, I think sometimes people assume that the reason Christians believe there's something beyond death is because we just can't deal with it. And just kind of have a wishful thinking that life shouldn't be that cruel, and it sounds more hopeful to say that there is something beyond death. But actually, Christians' conviction about what is beyond death isn't based on just hoping for it, but based on Jesus rising from the dead. So I might want to say to them, what do you think about Jesus' resurrection? Is that something you've ever questioned and ever thought about and looked at the evidence for? Because if he did rise from the dead, it answers so many questions. Not just that one, but whether God is there at all, and what God is like, and what the hope is for humans. So I'd say that's probably a good place to start if you want to know what the answer to that question is.
Okay. Miles, why do you think, why would people have that definite view that there is nothing after life on earth? Why do you think they have that very strong view, some people, that there is nothing, and they're adamant on that, rather than an open mind?
I think it's probably a combination of things. It would be different for every person, I guess. I mean, my own journey, I think probably the first conscious decision I made about faith, or what I believed, was to be an atheist, actually. So as a young teenager, my conviction for a while was that there is nothing beyond the material, beyond what we can touch and sense. And so I rejected the idea of Christianity that I'd been exposed to a little bit as a child outright. And I think for me it was partly because, to be honest, I hadn't looked into it very much. I mean, I wasn't any less informed than the average 13-year-old, but I wasn't very informed. And I hadn't really wrestled with those things. I think I'd absorbed what was quite a common view amongst my peers. So probably for a lot of people, it's something they haven't thought through too much. And of course, the same can be true of Christians. There can be Christians who haven't really thought these things through or wrestled with them too much. It's just happened almost by osmosis with the people around them. But I think often people don't explore these things. And actually, for me, what turned that upside down was what Emily was talking about. This outrageous good news that Christianity has, that Jesus has risen from the dead, that he has died, and because now he is alive, he shows us what is beyond death. And in the New Testament, Jesus is often described as first fruits. You imagine the agricultural image of a harvest, and there's the very first signs that there is fruit there. And what that means for the farmer is that there's plenty more coming. And what Jesus points out for us is what could be possible for those who put their trust in him, which is life beyond death. And that really turned things upside down for me, for someone who had kind of assumed these things but hadn't really worked them through. The story of Jesus, which we find in the Gospels, which I found to be true, was what really turned that around.
And of course, you look around us at the way the construction of Earth and the whole of the solar systems and beyond, remarkable that the view could be that just happened by chance. And I know we've covered that in other evenings. Are there any responses that you've got? Is there anyone that would like to follow that up with a question down here? Could we have a microphone? Run. Here we go. Oh, yes. We need quicker feet tonight.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
On a question of time or timing, I can't understand, it's God's sovereign right, but I can't understand why, shall we say, a husband or wife, one is saved, the other isn't, and then in another relationship, husband and wife, they're saved together. Now, from a human point of view, that's just not fair. But from God's point of view, I sort of understand why he doesn't do it, but I wish I did understand because I would love my husband to be a Christian.
Yeah.
And he says exactly what somebody said, when you're dead, you're dead. And we know you're not. So I just wondered what you all thought about that.
Okay, there's an interesting one. Who's got an eager look on their face on that one? Yeah.
Kick off. Really appreciate the question. Thank you for that. And that is a really big question, isn't it? And for those of us that are Christians, should we take this really seriously, that Christianity is true, and it's also really important that this doesn't just affect life now, it does affect life to come. And so that's why we take these things seriously. It's not a matter of here nor there whether people believe this or not. We'd say it actually does have big implications.
Yeah.
And we long for people to believe it. And like you said, for those close to us, we really long that they know and follow Jesus. And it can be really hard when people don't. And there are people close to me that don't know Jesus too. And in one sense, that makes me sad. I guess what we'd say is that actually God does give people real responsibility about how they respond to his offer of forgiveness through Jesus. The Bible says there's a response that we need to make to that, a response of turning from living our own way to following and trusting Jesus. And that he also respects the choice that we make, that he won't force upon us something we choose to reject. So whilst God takes the initiative in offering to all the world his forgiveness through Jesus and the offer of being saved, to use that language that you used, I'd say he also gives us the right, as it were, to also be able to reject that. Now, in one sense, that breaks our hearts when people do reject it. We long for them to accept it. But he doesn't force us into a relationship with him. Because actually, if being a Christian is about having a relationship with God, it can't be forced, can it? It has to also, in a sense, be chosen. But wonderfully, I think what we see is that actually God's offer of grace and forgiveness is one that he patiently holds out to us. It's not one that he kind of loses his temper and say, well, that's enough. Actually, throughout our lives, he longs for us to respond to it in that way and gives people the opportunity to. And as Christians, as a Christian myself, for those around me who don't know Jesus, I want to, as much as I can, share that with them as well, in the hope that they can respond to it in that way. But also I respect that they have the right to be able to accept it or reject it too. Yeah.
Any others? Any other comments on that? No? I mean, it is very personal, and when you're within a marriage situation, it is very difficult. I would just say that I had a chap sat next to me when I was baptized, and his wife was being baptized at the same time. And as she went to be baptized, he said, "I've prayed for this moment for 40 years." And she came to faith. And she gave him such a hard time because of his faith in their early years. And so, we must never give up. Never give up praying for people. So thank you for the question. Are there any other questions we've got? I'll ask, is there anyone? No, I'll ask one that we had, another one from the community day. If Lucifer is defeated, why is he so active? Okay, if Lucifer is defeated, why is he so active? Miles, would you like to? You've got that wisdom all written all over your face.
Not sure if everyone else is seeing that. We'll see what transpires. I guess it's part of a wider question, isn't it? Of of why there is still evil in the world. And I guess it talks about Lucifer being defeated. I think probably what the question is referring to is at the cross and the resurrection of Jesus that we've already talked about. God won the ultimate victory over evil, sin, death, all that's wrong about the world. And so the question is a good one. Why are things still rolling on as they are? Why are there still terrorist attacks? Why are there still people deceived and led away? Why are there still families that break down? Why does death and illness still happen? It's a really important question. I'm not going to pretend I can give a full answer to that. And there are often when Christians respond to this kind of issue, there are a number of things which some find helpful. One thing that I've found helpful, and again, let me just emphasize, it's not a complete answer, but it might help, comes in one of the books towards the end of the New Testament. It's written by a man called Peter, who you might have come across in the Gospel stories. And Peter is writing to friends of his, Christians, who were really asking that question. They were asking it by saying, why doesn't Jesus come back? And by that, they meant, why doesn't Jesus return and put all the wrong right and bring justice and make the world perfect as it should be? You know, that was what was going on for them. And this was as persecution was building up for Christians, so it was becoming harder and harder to be a Christian. They were kind of experiencing threats and violence and that kind of thing. So it was a real personal question. And he says this. This is how Peter responds. He says, but do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise. That means his promise to return and to put things right. He's not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he's patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. And I think what's wound up there in that very small little phrase is perhaps something of what we just dealt with in the last question. There are many, many people in the world who don't know what it means to be forgiven by God, who don't know what it means to be saved by God. If they were to face the end of the world tonight, they wouldn't know where they were heading. And so the reason that day is postponed, as it were, is to allow as much space as possible, all the time that's necessary, for all the people who will respond, to receive that grace. Because, of course, Lucifer's work is one thing, but all of us, in a way, are bound up in the sadness and the pain and the destruction in this world, even in little ways. We're all contributing to it. So if God was really to rid the world of evil and pain and suffering, we'd be implicated, wouldn't we? And so it seems perverse, but I think there's great wisdom there, that actually God is holding back that moment when he'll put everything right, when finally Lucifer will be done with, because he's wanting people to be saved and to experience eternity in perfect paradise with him. I mean, that's just part of an answer. I don't think anyone's got anything else they want to jump in with at that point.
If it just occurs to me, if God had actually, when Jesus died on the cross, that was the end. The devil had been completely victorious. That was the end. We wouldn't be here tonight, and we wouldn't be understanding what it is to know and love Jesus Christ. That God allowed time so that many, many people could come to know him. But the flip side of that is, of course, that it allowed the devil to be active in a very limited way. He's limited because we're sat here and we know and love Jesus. And he's limited because Jesus died on the cross. But it was all, as I see it, part of the plan of God, that all the people who will come to know him will have that chance.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Diane. And that really sums up many of the questions here, which is, that were on the Vox Pop, is why are things happening? Why isn't he doing anything about it? And one of the questions we also had is, why is God an absent landlord? So that feeling as though we are left alone. But the Bible says very clearly that the new kingdom has broken in. When Jesus died on the cross, God's kingdom is starting to break in. And as Christians, we can have real confidence that the Holy Spirit is within us and leading us forward. So we should be encouraged. When things happen, we know that they are going to happen. But but we should be encouraged. Is there any response to that? Any comments or questions that anyone has? Okay. We've probably got time for one more question. We're stopping at 5 past rather than 5:02. So thank you for that question there. Gareth, would you like to read out one of the...
Yeah, so we've had a few questions on a similar theme, which sort of follows on, I think. So I'll just read one that sort of sums up a few different questions we've had. Where are we in history according to Christianity? Some Christians talk as if the end of the world is right around the corner. Does humanity have a long time left?
It's about a week and a half, isn't it?
We often get these comments, aren't we, that the end of the world, well, ever since I've been alive, the end of the world is close by. And yes, it's happened down all through the ages. Who's the great wisdom on the end of the world within the panel? Emily. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Actually, it's a good question. We talk about the end of the world. Actually, what I want to say is that when it actually comes to the teaching of the Bible doesn't really talk about the end of the world at all. It talks about the restoration and the transformation of the world, but not the end of the world. And that's really important. Most people have this kind of thought that basically you've got the world as some kind of testing station to decide whether one day you can go up to heaven or down to hell. Actually, interesting, if you look through the Bible, do you know how many times you'll find heaven and hell together in a single verse of the Bible? Never. Because actually the Bible doesn't talk primarily about heaven and hell. It talks about heaven and earth. The original creation was heaven and earth together, united. And then we have in the Bible story this separation of heaven from earth, when earth goes into rebellion from God, when people turn their back on the God of the universe and go their own way. And earth, as it were, becomes hellish. And what's God's hope one day? What's the hope for our world? Not that God destroys the world, but that God will destroy the evil in our world and restore it and transform it. So what Christians look forward to is not the end of the world and going to heaven, but the restoration and transformation of the world and the destruction of evil. So that's an important thing to bear in mind, and it certainly turns your thinking when it comes to your view of humanity. Is humanity's days numbered? No, not at all. The Bible says humanity's days will go on into eternity, and this world will go on into eternity in the future. But the Bible does say there will be a moment in time, a decisive moment in time, when that transformation will occur. And we talk, sometimes you may hear Christians talking about the second coming of Christ. Jesus promised that actually just as he was physically here on earth, one day he will come back to restore all things. But it also says quite clearly that no one knows when that's going to happen. So the minute someone says, I know when it's going to happen, I say, no, you don't. And Jesus said, if people claim to know that, they don't. So we don't know. People sometimes like to put together some of the signs that Jesus spoke about and say, well, look, we've had an earthquake here in Mexico, and we've had this event here, and so on. Therefore, Jesus' second coming is around the corner. But actually, in one sense, those signs have been happening ever since the time of Christ. So I don't think we can read into them that it's going to happen tomorrow any more than it could have been last year or 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years' time. But Jesus also warns us in that same passage that Miles spoke about, not to be complacent and not to think because it hasn't happened, it's not going to happen. And it seems that the reason for the delay of that is not God's forgetfulness or that he doesn't care, but precisely the opposite. That if God's going to kick out what's wrong with the world, we actually need to ask the serious question, well, am I part of the problem? And actually, do I need to find that forgiveness and that transformation from him? Because if I want him to get rid of all that's wrong with the world, in my current state, that would be also including me. But wonderfully in Jesus, we have the offer of that forgiveness and transformation that can mean that I can not only be part of that future hope, but I can start to be an agent of change in the world now too.
Yeah. Have you ever thought it might change? I mean, I was given a book, and it's very fashionable now to have a bucket list. The 100 places you must see before you die, or something. Have you ever thought, because travel is a big thing these days, that actually if you're a Christian and you're going to inhabit the new earth, you don't need a bucket list of the 100 places, because you can go and see it in the new earth when it's perfect.
Absolutely.
So you know, at a leisurely pace, you might even float there, I don't know. Yeah. But have you ever thought it can actually affect the way you think about the way you live now? You don't actually need a bucket list.
No. So travel is not necessary from now on. Okay? There is somebody in this congregation who I have actually had that discussion with some years back, and I think it was our solace that we couldn't travel. So, but that's true. Is that that Paul says in Romans that the restoration process will actually make things better than God's original plan, and that whole restorative process is about that happening here and on earth and in heaven as well. A new earth and a new heaven. Well, look, it's 7:05, nearly 10 past, so we'll have a break there. We'll stop for about 10 minutes. There's teas and coffees and biscuits, cake at the back. Please do help yourselves, and we'll start again at about 20 past 7. 7:15, right. Okay, if you'd like to come back to your seats. Like to take your seats, and we will continue on for about 15 minutes. Could I just ask, whilst we're answering questions, if you have got a question, if you'd just like to put your hand up, the guys will come with the microphone so you're ready for when we finish, and then you can go straight into your questions. That may speed things up a little bit. So at any time, pop your hand up, and Tom or Gaynor will come to you. Oh, we're going to go through it now. We've got a number of questions, actually. Gareth has got at the back, so we're going to rattle through. There's a number of Bible-based questions that people have put forward. So, Gareth, would you like to ask the first one?
Yeah, just to let people know, there's about 35 questions so far, so we may not get to all of them before the evening's out. Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions about how to understand different parts of the Bible. So I'll start with an easy one and get harder. So the first one is, in Exodus, why did God harden Pharaoh's heart?
Okay, in Exodus.
Okay,
Michael.
so in the story of the Exodus, if you're not familiar with it, you've got Pharaoh over the nation of Egypt, and God sends Moses to Pharaoh to say, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, no, no. And we have these 10 plagues before Pharaoh finally lets the people of Israel leave from slavery out of Egypt, eventually to the land of Canaan. But then even then, he turns around and changes his mind at the last minute. And his army is destroyed in the process. Now, the Bible does say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But interestingly, there are 10 plagues, and you see there's a progression that's involved. So first of all, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then it says that Pharaoh's heart became hard. And then it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So actually, the initiation of that was Pharaoh. He was the one who hardened his heart to what God was saying. And God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart was actually a confirmation of Pharaoh's choice that he'd already made. And I think the progression's there if you read it in the story of Exodus. That actually God is not acting over and against Pharaoh's will, but in line with what Pharaoh chose to do, and gave him many opportunities to respond. I guess the warning to us is that if we continually hardened our hearts to what God says, our hearts, like Pharaoh's, can become hard. But also the wonderful thing is that God repeatedly gives people not just one, but many opportunities to respond to it.
Okay.
One of the things which you notice, though, as well, is something which happens continually through the Bible, is that when people do evil, and Pharaoh was an incredibly evil character, probably he's super evil, kind of by this point, when you go through Genesis and then this part of Exodus, God is able to take that intention to do evil and turn it inside out and subvert it to bring about good. And that's actually what you see here. And you see it time and time again, and most profoundly you see that at the cross of Jesus, where people are intent on evil, but God turns that evil around to bring great good, the ultimate good, into this world. So that happens often in Scripture, and Exodus is just one example of that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Miles. Gareth, do you want to read the next, the harder one?
Does the panel believe Genesis to be literal or pictorial? Does it matter?
Is Genesis literal or pictorial? Does it matter?
This is part of our lightning round, we've been told. So this is going to be quick answers to quick questions. I'm not sure, though. Christians differ on this kind of topic, and there's not enough time to go into all the details of that. I think certainly I imagine we're talking about the very early chapters of Genesis to do with creation, and then some other parts there. Certainly those very early chapters, certainly the first 3, they read differently to other parts of the Old Testament that are recounting history. That's not to say that they aren't literal, but that primarily the author is trying to do something different, I think. So primarily, I think the author is using poetry, because that evokes something in a different way, to just laying out the facts in a very kind of sort of straightforward way. And also, I think primarily, if you can do two things primarily, the author is doing theology, and he's showing us how human beings relate to God, and who we are in light of who God is and what God has done, and that he is creator and he is sovereign. So there's a bunch of things that we're meant to, everyone agrees we're meant to take out of these chapters, that God is creator, God is the source of life, God is sustainer, we are under his lordship. That's without a doubt. But Christians will disagree about how literally they should take those things, as in, was it 6 days of creation about 6 or 10,000 years ago, or was it something much longer ago, and is this more picture language? So we can talk more later if you want to get into that.
And in a one-word answer, does it matter?
I think those kind of important theological points really do matter. I mean, so much is packed into Genesis 1 to 3 that literally you wouldn't understand the rest of the Bible if you didn't have those first 3 chapters. It's essential that we get those things clear. But how we think that rolls out in terms of how exactly God created and how many years ago that was, I don't think that matters as much. I think it's important that we have a high view of Scripture, and it's important that we get those theological building blocks in place. But other things I think we can agree to disagree on.
Great.
Just a little book plug, if you want. This book, by John Lennox, Professor of Maths at Oxford, God's Undertaker, a Science-Buried God, deals with that a bit. But he's also written another one, which is not on the bookstall, but you could probably get from Keith Jones, called 7 Days That Divide the World. And in that, he looks at the early chapters of Genesis, and in particular says, how should we read these chapters? He says, actually, if you look back historically, there were some Christians who would have said a literal reading of the Bible meant that you thought the world was flat. Although I'm not sure many Christians would say that today. And so he says we have to be careful, what does Scripture actually say, rather than trying to read into Scripture what we want it to say.
Yeah.
And as Miles said, actually, what is the primary question that Genesis is wanting to ask, or answer, as it were? And I don't think it's primarily exactly how old is the world, but I think there are some very big questions. And of course, there are secondary questions that we might want to ask. So 7 Days That Divide the World, really helpful discussion on that. It's only a small book, but it's worth getting hold of.
Great. Thank you. Gareth, next one, please.
Is homosexual practice the worst of the sins Paul lists in Romans 1? Is it the same as being same-sex attracted?
Okay. Who would like to take that? You want to take that, Michael?
I think, firstly, I'd say, so in Romans chapter 1 in the New Testament, it talks about a number of different things. One of the things it talks about is homosexual practice, and we see that, and other things too. I think what we would want to say is that there is a difference between homosexual orientation in terms of desire and practice. I think we'd also want to say that when it's talked about there, Christians have often made this a kind of category of sin on its own, separate to all others. And I think we want to be really careful that we don't do that as well. Actually, Romans 1 talks about a number of different things, and where it's also mentioned in 1 Corinthians 6, it talks about a number of different things as well. So we don't want to kind of categorize that as separate or somehow different in style. I guess another thing that would be worth saying is that is a huge topic, though, and I'm aware, particularly in Western culture today, the Bible's teaching on this matter really cuts against the grain of where people are thinking on it. And so a 5-minute answer or even a 2-minute answer is not going to be able to respond to all of that in any way, shape or form that's satisfactory. We did do a whole evening on that a while back, and it'll be online and you could look at that topic being explored in more detail. But also a book plug again. Sorry, all the books I'm plugging are not actually on the bookstall. But someone this morning just showed me they've been reading it as well. It's called A Better Story by Glyn Harrison. And it looks at really how in the West we've come to think the way we do about sexual orientation. And it's very interesting that kind of we assume that the way we think is the way everyone thinks. And that's certainly not true even across Europe, let alone the world. And then think about what the Bible might have to say about that. And that's a whole book that would be worth looking at, and really recommend that if you would look into it more.
Okay, so if anyone wants those book review or book recommendations, speak to you afterwards.
Yeah, if you can't remember the title, come and speak to me.
I've forgotten it already.
Glyn
But,
Harrison, a better story.
Great.
I imagine most people aren't interested in kind of a walk through Genesis, Romans 1, not Revelation or Genesis, Romans 1. But if the person who asked the question wants to come back, we can talk about it more later. I think there's some really interesting things Paul is doing in that chapter that we could chat about. So
And that's the purpose of this evening, isn't it? It's really, it's like touching a number of different subjects and the opportunities then to explore how to take those forward. We'll run through those with you later and let you know what is coming up that can help to answer some of those questions. Okay, are there any questions from the floor at all? Is there anyone who has a question? Have we got over here? Yeah, if we could have the microphone over here, that would be great.
What I want to ask is, in the book of Esther, Mordecai's life was spared by the king. I don't really understand that book very well. How did the king spare Mordecai's life in that book of Esther? Anyone can answer that question?
Okay. Book of Esther.
Well, he had to give a counter edict. He'd set an edict saying all the Jews should be killed. And the only way he could spare Mordecai and all the Jews' lives was to then say the Jews could defend themselves. So God actually, if you like, the king himself had to overrule or give powers to the Jews to defend themselves. Because, if you like, Jesus was a Jew, the line of the Jews. They were God's people, and he wanted to spare them. So that's the simple answer.
Okay. Anyone? Are you happy with that? Yeah. That's fine. Is there another question? Gareth, please.
Yeah, I probably should have asked this at the beginning of the section before I asked all the Bible questions. But how can we know that what's said in the Bible is the truth and not made up? How can we know what's said in the Bible is the truth and not made up?
Emily, would you like to?
Yeah. That's a massive question. It's a very good question. There's so much that you could say about that. We do have a whole book about it on the bookstall called Why Trust the Bible, which is really helpful. It answers 10 questions about the Bible and how you know it's true. I think there's kind of two ways that I guess I've found answers to that question. I think one of them is that as you come to know God, we believe that as Christians, the Bible is inspired by God's Spirit, and that God doesn't lie. And so as you come to know God and trust him, you trust what he said and what he's wanted to be passed on, and that was what God intended for us to receive. But also, I think, again, coming back to Jesus and thinking about who he was, he's kind of the pinnacle of everything that the Bible talks about. The whole Old Testament leads up to Jesus, and then we kind of carry on as Christians after Jesus. And so I guess the question is, if Jesus really is who he said he was and he is God, then the words that he spoke are true. And he trusted the Old Testament. He quoted from it. He said that it was true. He said it was God's word. So I guess those are two things that have helped me to figure that question out.
Okay. Michael.
I think that's really helpful to focus in, to start with, on the person of Jesus. He is the centre of the story, as it were. And so if you wanted to investigate Jesus, you'd have to look at the Gospels, wouldn't you? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those 4 accounts of his life, of course, referred to as well in some of the letters written later on. And how do we know they're not made up? That's a good question, because actually, if they are made up, I don't want to believe it. Christianity makes historical claims that, and the early Christians were quite happy to say, look, if Jesus didn't really live, die, and importantly rise again, it's not worth believing. So it really is an important question to ask. There are a number of ways that we want to actually look into that. And historians, when they look at any kind of event in history, will want to ask a number of questions about it. And that's the same kind of thing that we want to do with the Gospels. Were they written by contemporaries of Jesus? Well, yes, they were. They weren't written hundreds of years later like other accounts of other religious leaders. They were written at a time when eyewitnesses were still alive. That's very important. Does it fit with other historical events? Well, yes, it does. When it refers to places, events, customs, everything else, it fits historically in a way that other claimed kind of Gospels later on don't. What was the motive of the people writing the Gospels? That'd be another question to ask. Did they have anything to gain from making these stories up? And actually the answer is absolutely not. Many of them were persecuted for what they claimed. Why would you make up a story that gets you into trouble? You would normally make up a story to get yourself out of trouble. And so you'd have to ask the question, if they were making it up, why on earth did they? And why didn't they tell people they were making it up when it actually didn't seem to advance their cause at all? And then another thing that's worth looking at is that we don't just have one account of the life of Jesus, but we have four different accounts. And if you're to look at them, and if they are, as they're claimed to be, containing real eyewitness testimony, what you'd expect is that those accounts wouldn't be identical, as if they just copied from each other, but they shouldn't also be contradictory, kind of making up stories that obviously contradict others. And what we see in the Gospels is that the testimony there is complementary. And complementary in a way that it would be hard to kind of fake or just invent. And so we see that actually these different stories relate together in a way that is authentic. The kind of way that you'd expect if it was real eyewitness testimony and not just being invented by others. So there are a whole load of different questions we want to ask about these events. Does it get corroborated by other sources and so on? And what do they say? And we can look into that as well. So start with Jesus, start with the Gospels, look there, and then if you've got reasons to take Jesus seriously, then you've got some really good reasons to take the rest of it seriously too.
And that's very much a part of the Alpha course that we've got coming up. So I'll give more details on that. I'm conscious of time. We've got a couple more questions. Is there any questions from the floor at all? Gareth, I know, has got running through his final ones. Do you want to give us another one there, Gareth, please?
Yep. So this person writes, I don't believe in Christianity because there are so many denominations. Surely if Christians believed the Bible to be true and the exact words of God, all Christians would be the same, living, acting, and worshipping in the same way.
Okay.
I think that's a nice idea, and it would be great if that were the case. I think from my own experience, I've been a Christian not a very long time, maybe 15 years at the max, and in that time, my view has changed on some things, and I think most Christians in this room would experience the same thing, that you think one way about a particular issue that could be contentious, and you read some more, you reflect, you pray, you talk to people, and sometimes your view will change. And it's one of the realities, I think, of the church. And it is good that we have the freedom to explore these things, that we can each, as Christians, come to the Bible and we can try and make sense of it ourselves. But some of the fallout from that is that Christians will sometimes disagree. I think what's really important, though, is that Christians do agree on some of those most foundational and important things, like Michael was talking about, things like the resurrection of Jesus, the death of Jesus. That is the grounds for everything else. Those things are held by all Christians. And so you could look at some of the historic creeds. They're really helpful if you're wanting to look at something very old and something that sets out really what the church believes. Something like the Apostolic Creed. And that would be a good place to begin to define what Christianity is all about. But you're right, Christians do disagree on things, and hopefully we can disagree in a friendly way.
If I discovered that every church in the world looked exactly the same, practiced everything in exactly the same way, I'm not sure that would make me more inclined to think it was true, but maybe more inclined to think there was some big kind of conspiracy being controlled by someone from the top. The fact that there's an organic ability for churches to be different and express themselves in different ways, far from being something that makes me think Christianity isn't true, makes me think actually there is something, a core of something true behind here. And yeah, it can be expressed in different ways, in different cultures, and it's grown organically. It's not being controlled all from the top. People have tried that, often that doesn't really help. But right from the outset, it was a movement, kind of a grassroots movement. Christianity for 300 years didn't have any power structures or authority structures. It was very much kind of an underground movement. And actually Christianity thrives best today when it's not trying to be controlled and kind of homogenized into identical forms, but is allowed to grow in that organic way.
Great, thank you. Mike, question over here.
Yes, it's great that shortly we'll have Baroness Cox coming to spend the weekend with us. Wonderful lady. But how do the panel respond to what I perceive as a growing trend to want to exclude Bible-believing Christians from public office?
Yeah. The political...
Where, Mike? Are you just referring to the UK? It's a very big general question there.
Okay, specifics. Politicians who have a strong Bible belief are now being ridiculed and told they are not suitable for that public office.
So you're referring to people like Tim Farron, then?
As an example, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we, if you wind the clock back a few decades, maybe 100 years, we have been in quite a peculiar period in the history of the church. By and large, the church has been on the edge of society because they chose to live by the values of Jesus. They have been persecuted. They have been kind of restricted in what they can get involved in, and that's normally been the experience of Christians. And actually, if you go around the world, that's often the experience of Christians today in different parts of the world. So the idea of Christendom that we look back to, and some people look back to fondly, is quite an odd phenomenon that really is running its course, and it's coming to an end, really. And I think that's what we're experiencing. It's worrying, I suppose, in one sense, because there probably will be less Christians in authoritative positions in our country in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. But at the same time, when we look at the history of the church, sometimes those have been the most fruitful times. I wonder if those first 300 years that Michael referred to were a more fruitful time of growth than the centuries that followed under Constantine, with Christianity as the Roman official religion. And equally, the effectiveness of the church in China when Christianity was outlawed is remarkable. So I wouldn't want to encourage, kind of wish persecution on us, not for a second. But at the same time, I wonder if sometimes God can use Christians on the fringe, Christians who are opposed often in remarkable ways to advance his kingdom. So that's not a very strong answer, but it's some thoughts.
Is there any other comments on that? I think, we've got one question here. We'll probably have to make this the last one. I'm just, we've got one more from Gareth, I'm being told.
Hello. Hi. Many people would accuse Christians of being hypocrites. How would you respond to that? I have an answer to that, but I just want to know what you would think. How would you respond to that? If people say Christians are hypocrites.
Okay. Emily. Thanks, Josh.
So a hypocrite is someone who says that they're something, but they're not. It's kind of two-faced. So if this person has met Christians who claim to be perfect or who claim to be somehow superior to other people, and then they've seen in their lives they're clearly not, because nobody's perfect, then I'd say, well, fair enough, maybe they were. And that's not necessarily representative of every Christian. But I think what Christians, when people see Christians fail, I would hope that those Christians never claimed that they wouldn't fail. And I would definitely say as a Christian that my claim isn't to be morally perfect or superior in any way to anyone else. And actually, that's the heart of the Christian message, is that all of us have failed in different ways. We don't love people and we don't love God the way that we're meant to, but that in Jesus, forgiveness is available for us. So that's the good news. That's the heart of it. It's not, I've become a Christian, so now I'm necessarily a better person than anyone else. Or even that you can see straight away that all my flaws are gone. Hopefully that kind of changes with time. So I would say, have you met Christians who are claiming to be perfect? Or are you just disappointed because they fail? Well, of course they fail. But there's forgiveness on offer. That's what the heart of the Christian message is.
Okay, thank you. Okay, last question, Gareth, please. Thanks.
Yeah, as I said earlier, there were loads more questions. So I guess if your question didn't get answered, sorry, and I'm sure the panel would love to chat more individually. But I thought we'd finish with one that maybe sounds like quite a simple question, but potentially quite important for the person that asked it. In fact, two questions that are quite closely connected. Why do we have to believe something to be a Christian? Why do we have to believe something to be a Christian? And then someone else asked, I believe there's a God. Am I therefore okay to call myself a Christian?
Okay, a double question. Michael, do you want to take
Great.
that? He's got a smile.
So, what does it mean to believe? Is believing in God enough? There's an interesting verse, actually, in one of the letters in the New Testament that says, you believe in God, great. Well, the devil believes in God, but he's obviously not a Christian. So, obviously, believing in the objective existence of God may not quite qualify for being a Christian status. So, what does? Well, interesting, I don't think when the Bible talks about belief, it's simply talking about intellectual assent. It's not less than that, but it's kind of more than that. There are certain things that we would have to believe. It'd be quite hard to be a Christian and disbelieve in the historical person of Jesus or the resurrection of Christ, because those things are foundational claims on which Christianity is built. But it is more than just an intellectual assent into this happens, or this existed, or this is true. The word to believe is also connected to the idea of to trust. It is actually to place the weight of your life behind something. I guess it's the difference between if I were to go parachute jumping and you ask me, do you think that parachute can take your weight and will save your life? I might say yes, but the evidence of my belief will be shown in whether I will actually get in that plane and jump out of it with a parachute on my back. And if I say I believe it, but I'm not willing to actually put my life, as it were, under the weight of that parachute or under the control of it, then in one sense I don't. So I'm not trusting it. Someone once said to me recently, they said, well, I don't have to believe that 2 + 2 = 4, I just know it. I said, well, yes, true, but 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't actually have any implications for your life. But actually, whether or not I put my trust in Jesus does, it has implications for my life for now and for eternity. So it's not less than, but it's more than intellectual assent. It's got to require understanding some things and discovering that they're true, but then it's more than that. I guess like in a relationship, you can't really have a relationship with someone who you don't think exists, but it takes a lot more than just knowing that they exist to actually trust that person. It means getting to know them. That's why I want to say, don't just get to know about the historical evidence for the Gospels in that kind of objective way, but start reading them. Look at the person of Jesus and ask yourself the question, if this person really did exist and really did say these things and do these things, is this someone I can trust with my life or not? And that's what real belief is, to come to that position of trust. And that might take time. It will certainly mean that you need to get to know him and to start looking into it for yourself. But do that, because as you do, I think you'll discover that it is something that's worth putting your trust behind.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's about all we've got time for this evening. We did say that this very much is a case of taking bite-sized chunks of lots of questions. We do have a new Alpha series starting on Monday the 25th of September here at the church. We have, again, the same format, which is a meal to start with, and then an opportunity really to go into discussion on a whole number of different areas. A great opportunity to come along, to bring friends along, to really explore in detail some of those areas that you have questions about. So I would recommend that you come along to that. Books, Michael?
Just to say, there is a bookstall next door. Please do go and have a look at it. And these are really helpful, either if you're still asking questions to find out further answers in more detail, or even if you kind of feel satisfied with the answers in a way to help you help others too. We mentioned John Lennox's book, God's Undertaker, a really good book on science-related questions and questions about origins. Why Trust the Bible, as we mentioned, if you want to particularly look at issues of the authority and reliability of the Bible. This really interesting book, If God, Then What, by Andrew Wilson. Really helpful book, just saying, look, if there is a God, what are the implications of that for my life and for the world and so on? And so he explores that in a really readable manner. Jesus for Skeptics by Michael Green. Michael Green has lectured in theology in various different academic institutions. He's also into the classics. He is a historian, and he really unpacks the historical evidence for Jesus, but in a very accessible and readable way in that little booklet. So if you're skeptical or you know a skeptic friend, then that book will help. This book is by a guy called Michael Otts. Don't know who he is. It's called What Kind of God? And apparently that explores some of the big objections that you might have, particularly the moral objections to Christianity, like suffering or hell or sexuality.
And that one's free tonight?
That one, we pay you to take that one away. And then a couple by a guy called Timothy Keller, who for much of his life was pastor of a very large church in New York. But really helpfully, he is very good at engaging with those who may have all sorts of questions and skeptics, as he's done over his lifetime in New York City. The Reason for God also deals with a number of those objections about the Christian faith. But even further back than that, Making Sense of God. How does Christianity make sense of life? What kind of answers does it have for those existential desires that we have in life? Making Sense of God, really helpful. They're all slightly reduced on normal price, so you can get a bargain too. But go and have a look and take a book home as well.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for coming along tonight. We hope that's helpful. Could you give a round of applause to the panel? That's... I'm sure there's many of us that would think, oh dear, I couldn't do that. I couldn't sit there and have questions thrust upon us. So thank you to you. We're here on a number of activities throughout the week here at Lansdowne. We are here on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings, all on the website. Do please, if you've got any questions, come and speak to any of us, and enjoy more tea, coffee and cake through to the hall. Thank you.